Claire's fingers traced the faded lines of the blueprint, blue ink long faded to the color of old bruises. The basement archive smelled of dust and forgotten things. Decades of municipal records slowly decaying in their manila folders. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, fighting a losing battle against the shadows between the tall metal shelves. "Just digitize the essential ones," her supervisor had said, not understanding that every blueprint was essential. Every architectural drawing told a story. She just hadn't expected them to tell their stories quite so literally. The first time it happened, she'd thought she was hallucinating from too much coffee and too little sleep. A blueprint for the old Mason Street library had filled her head with the sound of hammers and saws, workmen complaining about union rates in accents that hadn't been heard in the city for 50 years. Now, 3 weeks into the job, she'd learned to brace herself before touching the original drawings. Some were quiet, routine office buildings with routine lives. Others... Her hand hovered over the next folder in the stack. City Hall Annex, 1947. The paper felt wrong before she even unfolded it, like static electricity building before a storm. The first touch brought voices, sharp and angry. "The money has to be moved tonight. If anyone finds out, Reeves knows too much." Then a sound she'd never heard in any blueprint before. A single gunshot, followed by silence. Claire jerked her hand away, the fluorescent light flickering as if in sympathy. In the distance, somewhere in the maze of shelves, she heard footsteps. She wasn't supposed to be here this late. No one was. The footsteps came closer. Claire gathered the blueprints with trembling hands, trying to quiet the rustle of paper. The footsteps echoed off the archive walls, measured and deliberate. Not the hurried pace of another researcher late at night, but something more purposeful. A shadow moved between the shelves, cast by the security lights in the hallway outside. Whoever it was hadn't turned on the main lights. They didn't want to be seen. She slipped the 1947 blueprints into her messenger bag, heart pounding. The archives operated on an honor system. Technically, nothing was supposed to leave the building, but technically, she wasn't supposed to hear dead men's last words in architectural drawings either. The footsteps stopped. Claire held her breath, pressing herself against a shelf of land surveys from the 1980s. The fluorescent light above her flickered and died, leaving her in the dim glow filtering in from the hallway. "Hello?" A man's voice, smooth and professional. "Security. The building's closed." Claire almost laughed with relief, just a guard doing his rounds. She stepped out from behind the shelf. "Sorry, I was just finishing up some cataloging. I have authorization to..." The words died in her throat. The man wore a security uniform, but his hand rested too casually on his holstered weapon. Real security guards didn't stand like that. Didn't watch you with eyes that calculated rather than questioned. "ID?" he asked, moving closer. His shoes were too expensive for a guard's salary, his haircut too precise. Claire clutched her bag tighter. "Of course! It's right." She patted her pockets, taking a step backward. "I must have left it upstairs. Why don't we go get it?" His smile never reaching sincerity. "Together." Another step back. The archive's layout unfolded in her mind. She'd spent weeks memorizing it, tracing the paths between shelves like streets on a map. 3 rows to the emergency exit. If she could just... The guard's radio crackled. He glanced down for just a moment, but it was enough. Claire turned and ran, her footsteps thundering through the quiet archives. Behind her, she heard a curse and the sound of pursuit. She ducked left, right, left again, letting the shelves blur past. The emergency exit's red glow beckoned ahead. Almost there. Her hand hit the push bar just as something whistled past her ear. The sound of breaking glass followed her into the stairwell. Not a security guard. Definitely not a security guard. Claire took the stairs 3 at a time, her bag thumping against her hip. The blueprints inside felt warm, almost alive, like they were trying to tell her something else. But she couldn't stop. Couldn't touch them. Couldn't let the voices in. Not now. She burst out into the parking lot, the night air heavy with late summer heat. Her old Volvo sat 3 rows back, its faded blue paint almost black in the darkness. The keys shook in her hand as she fought to find the right one. Behind her, the emergency exit slammed open. She dove into the car, jammed the key into the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice. come on, she pleaded, footsteps on asphalt, getting closer. The engine roared to life. Claire slammed the car into reverse just as the man reached her window. Their eyes met for a moment, his widening in surprise, hers narrowing in determination. She floored it. The Volvo shot backward, driver's side mirror catching the man's uniform. He stumbled, cursing, and Claire saw the glint of metal in his hand. She threw the car into drive and peeled out of the parking lot, tires screaming on asphalt. In her rearview mirror, the man grew smaller, then vanished. He wasn't chasing her. He didn't need to. They both knew where she worked, where she lived. The blueprint in her bag seemed to pulse with remembered violence. A gunshot over 50 years ago, echoing into tonight. Thomas Reeves had known too much then. Now she did too. Claire drove through empty streets, hands tight on the wheel. She couldn't go home, couldn't go to the police. Not without proof, not with just voices from old paper. She needed somewhere to think, somewhere to make sense of what the blueprints were trying to tell her. Her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. The archives have seen enough death already. Walk away. Claire turned off her phone, then turned her car toward the only person she could trust, her old professor, Dr. Mark Smith. If anyone would believe her about voices and blueprints, it would be the man who'd taught her that buildings hold more stories than most people ever hear. The city stretched out around her, a maze of streets and secrets. Somewhere in those blueprints was the truth about Thomas Reeves. She just had to live long enough to find it. Dr. Smith's Victorian-style house sat back from the street, its gables casting strange shadows in the streetlight. Like everything about her old professor, it was meticulously preserved, but somehow out of step with time. More a museum piece than a home. Claire had spent countless hours here during grad school, discussing architectural theory over tea in his book-lined study. Now she stood on his porch at 2 a.m., wondering if she was about to sound completely insane. The porch light clicked on before she could knock. Dr. Smith opened the door, wearing a faded Harvard sweatshirt and reading glasses, looking exactly as he had when she'd taken his advanced architectural history seminar 5 years ago. Claire? His eyes went from her face to her messenger bag, then to the empty street behind her. Come inside, quickly. She followed him through the familiar hallway, past walls lined with framed blueprints and architectural drawings. In his study, books and papers covered every surface except for 2 leather armchairs and a small table between them. Sit, he said, closing the curtains. Tell me what you found. Claire stared at him. How did you... Why else would one of my best students show up in the middle of the night looking like she's seen a ghost? He settled into the chair opposite her. And given your new position at the archives, I assume this involves something you found there. She pulled out the 1947 blueprints with trembling hands, hesitating. How could she explain what was happening? That she heard voices in old paper? That buildings whispered their secrets to her? Dr. Smith had taught her to think critically, to question everything. He'd laugh her out of his study. I found something in the City Hall Annex plans, she said carefully. Something about Thomas Reeves and missing development funds. I think... She swallowed hard. I think I found evidence of murder. Dr. Smith leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. The City Hall Annex. I wondered if you'd find these. His voice held something. Recognition, fear. Tell me everything, but stick to the facts, Claire. What's on paper? The blueprints felt warm in her hands, eager to share their stories. But she kept silent about the voices, about the gunshot that echoed through decades. Some truths were harder to prove than others.